Border Control agents disrespected Jinkee Pacquiao at Los Angeles International Airport, treating her like a criminal, humiliating her in front of hundreds of travelers, questioning her documents with suspicion, and making racist assumptions about her simply because she was Filipina. But what they didn't know was who she really was, who her husband was, and what kind of power and connections the Pacquiao family had. 9 minutes after the incident, those agents were fired instantly, their careers destroyed, their reputations ruined, and their actions became a viral scandal that sparked international outrage and led to major policy changes at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Stay tuned because this story will show you the ugly reality of racial profiling that still exists in 2023, the courage it takes to stand up against authority abuse, the swift justice that can happen when powerful people refuse to be silenced, and the important lessons about respect, dignity, and equal treatment that every border agent, every law enforcement officer, and every human being needs to learn. The date was October 15, 2023, a Sunday afternoon at Los Angeles International Airport, Terminal B, the International Arrivals Section. Jinkee Pacquiao, wife of boxing legend and Filipino Senator Manny Pacquiao, had just landed after a 14-hour flight from Manila to Los Angeles, traveling with her 2 daughters, Princess and Queenie, ages 17 and 15. They were coming to LA for a combination of shopping, family vacation, and to visit relatives who lived in the greater Los Angeles area. The flight had been long but comfortable in business class, and Jinkee was looking forward to clearing customs quickly, getting their luggage, and heading to their hotel in Beverly Hills. Jinkee was dressed elegantly but not ostentatiously, wearing a cream-colored Chanel blazer, designer jeans, Louboutin heels, and carrying a Birkin bag. Her daughters were dressed similarly upscale, but age-appropriate. Their appearance was polished, sophisticated, typical of wealthy Asian travelers who frequently visit Los Angeles for luxury shopping and tourism. Their passports were Philippine diplomatic passports, issued because of Manny's position as senator, which should have guaranteed them expedited processing and courteous treatment at immigration. They joined the line for non-U.S. citizens, which was moderately long with about 40 people ahead of them, mostly Asian tourists, some European business travelers, and a few families. The wait time was approximately 30 minutes, and during that time, Jinkee noticed something disturbing. She observed that the Caucasian travelers were being processed quickly and courteously, with smiles and minimal questions. But the Asian travelers, particularly those who appeared to be Filipino, Chinese, or Vietnamese based on their documents and appearance, were being subjected to much longer questioning, more document scrutiny, and in some cases, secondary screening. When it was finally Jinkee's turn, she approached the immigration booth, booth number 7, where a male border control agent sat behind the glass partition. The agent's name, visible on his badge, was Officer David Morrison, a white male in his early 40s with a crew-cut, stern expression and an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. Jinkee handed over their 3 diplomatic passports with a polite smile and a greeting of good afternoon. Officer Morrison took the passports without acknowledging her greeting, without making eye contact, without any courtesy whatsoever. He opened the first passport, Jinkee's, and stared at it for an unusually long time, flipping through the pages, examining the visa stamps, checking the photo against her face repeatedly. Then he looked up at her with obvious suspicion in his eyes, and asked in a tone that was more interrogation than inquiry, "What is the purpose of your visit to the United States?" "Tourism and shopping," Jinkee answered politely, maintaining her composure despite the uncomfortable tone. "We're here for 1 week staying at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel." Morrison's expression didn't change. He continued with rapid-fire questions that felt aggressive rather than procedural. "Who's paying for this trip? What do you do for work? How much money are you bringing into the country? Do you have proof of hotel reservations? Do you have a return ticket? Why do you have diplomatic passports? What does your husband do?" Jinkee answered each question patiently. "My husband and I are paying for the trip. I'm a businesswoman. I own several businesses in the Philippines. We're bringing a reasonable amount for shopping and expenses. Yes, I have hotel confirmation on my phone. Yes, we have return tickets for next Sunday. We have diplomatic passports because my husband is a senator in the Philippines, and my husband is Manny Pacquiao, the boxing champion and senator." The mention of Manny Pacquiao should have changed everything. Any reasonably informed person, especially someone working at LAX, which sees thousands of international travelers daily, should have recognized the name. Manny Pacquiao is not just a Filipino celebrity. He's a global icon, a boxing legend who fought multiple times in Las Vegas and Los Angeles, who has millions of fans in the United States, who has been featured on every major sports network and magazine in America. But Officer Morrison's reaction was the opposite of recognition or respect. He smirked, a condescending smirk that Jinkee immediately recognized as mockery. "Manny Pacquiao?" he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Sure, and I'm married to Beyoncé. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to be honest with me. A lot of people from your country try to enter the US with fake stories, fake documents, claiming to be related to famous people. So let's try this again. What is your real purpose for coming to the United States?" Jinkee felt her face flush with anger and humiliation. Her daughters, standing beside her, looked shocked and embarrassed. The implication was clear. Officer Morrison didn't believe her, thought she was lying, assumed she was some kind of scammer or illegal immigrant trying to con her way into the country. And the phrase, "people from your country," was coded language, a barely disguised racist assumption that Filipinos were dishonest, that they were trying to illegally immigrate, that they couldn't possibly be legitimate wealthy tourists. "Officer," Jinkee said, her voice still controlled but with an edge of steel, "I am telling you the truth. My husband is Senator Manny Pacquiao. You can verify this with a simple internet search. We have diplomatic passports, which you're holding in your hands. We have proper documentation for everything. I don't appreciate being accused of lying." Morrison leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in a posture of dominance and dismissiveness. "Ma'am, I decide who enters this country and who doesn't. And right now, your story doesn't add up. Diplomatic passport or not, I have the authority to send you to secondary screening for additional questioning. So I suggest you adjust your attitude and cooperate fully, or this is going to take a lot longer than you want." At that moment, another border agent approached Booth 7. This was Officer Sarah Chen, an Asian American woman in her 30s, who had been observing the interaction from a nearby station. She leaned toward Morrison and whispered something, probably suggesting that he should verify Jinkee's identity or treat her with more courtesy. But Morrison waved her off dismissively, actually telling her to mind your own station, in a tone that was rude even to his colleague. Morrison then pulled out a red card from his drawer, which in CBP procedures indicates that the traveler is being flagged for secondary inspection. He stamped it with booth number and time, and slid it across to Jinkee along with the 3 passports. "You and your daughters need to proceed to secondary screening, room C12, down that hallway to your right. Bring all your luggage, all your electronics, and be prepared for a thorough inspection. Secondary screening is the place where travelers suspected of smuggling, document fraud, or other violations are sent for extensive questioning and bag searches. It can take hours, it's humiliating, and it's supposed to be reserved for cases where there's legitimate suspicion, not for targeting based on racial profiling or personal bias." Jinkee took the passports and the red card, her hands trembling slightly with anger, but maintained her dignity. She gathered her daughters, who were now visibly upset, and walked toward the secondary screening area. As they walked, Princess, the older daughter, asked in Tagalog, "Mom, why are they treating us like this? We didn't do anything wrong." Jinkee responded also in Tagalog, "Because some people judge based on how we look, not who we are. But don't worry, this will be resolved." Then she pulled out her phone and sent a text message to her husband Manny, who was in Manila at that time. The message was brief. "Being detained at LAX secondary screening. Agent disrespected and racially profiled us. Morrison, badge 4782, need your help." In room C12, the secondary screening area was a large open space with rows of metal tables, chairs bolted to the floor, and several private rooms for intensive searches. There were about 20 other travelers there, almost all of them people of color, Latinos, Asians, Middle Easterners. The racial pattern was obvious and disturbing. A different agent, Officer James Tucker, called Jinkee over to one of the tables and instructed them to place all their luggage and personal items on the table. Tucker was a white male in his 50s, overweight, with a permanent scowl on his face. He began going through their suitcases with unnecessary roughness, dumping clothes onto the table, opening every zippered compartment, squeezing bottles of cosmetics, examining shoes, essentially treating their belongings like evidence in a criminal investigation. "So you say you're here for shopping?" Tucker asked while handling Jinkee's personal items with no respect for privacy. "How much money did you bring? How do I know you're not planning to work illegally here? How do I know these expensive items you're carrying aren't counterfeit?" The accusation about counterfeit items was particularly insulting. Jinkee's Birkin bag alone was worth $50,000. Her watch was a Patek Philippe worth $80,000, and her jewelry was all authentic designer pieces. But Tucker was implying that because she was Filipina, these items must be fake, that someone like her couldn't possibly afford genuine luxury goods. "Everything I'm carrying is authentic," Jinkee responded, her patience wearing thin. "I can provide receipts and certificates of authenticity if needed, and I already explained to Officer Morrison that we're here for tourism and shopping. My husband is a senator and a world champion boxer. We are not here to work illegally. This treatment is completely unwarranted." Tucker looked up from the suitcase he was searching and laughed. Actually laughed in her face. "Lady, do you know how many people come through here every day claiming to be rich, claiming to be connected to celebrities, claiming to have some special status? You all say the same things. You all have the same excuses. And guess what? Most of you are lying." At that moment, a supervisor entered the room. This was Agent Michael Rodriguez, a Latino man in his late 40s who held the position of CBP Supervisory Officer for Terminal B. He had been alerted by Officer Sarah Chen, the Asian American agent who had tried to intervene earlier, that there might be a problem with how the Pacquiao family was being treated. Rodriguez had done a quick Google search on his phone while walking to the secondary screening room, and what he found made his blood run cold. Jinkee Pacquiao was indeed the wife of Manny Pacquiao, legendary boxer, 8-division world champion, senator of the Philippines, humanitarian, and one of the most famous athletes in the world. The diplomatic passports were completely legitimate. The family was well known in the Philippines and internationally, and there was absolutely no reason to subject them to this kind of treatment. Rodriguez approached the table where Tucker was still roughly handling their belongings and intervened immediately. "Agent Tucker, I need to speak with you privately. Now." His tone left no room for argument. They stepped aside, and Rodriguez showed Tucker his phone screen with Manny Pacquiao's Wikipedia page, news articles about the family, photos of Jinkee at various international events. Tucker's face went pale. He realized instantly that he had made a massive mistake, that his colleague Morrison had made an even bigger mistake, and that they were both potentially in serious trouble. Rodriguez returned to Jinkee with an apologetic expression. "Mrs. Pacquiao, I am deeply sorry for this situation. There has been a misunderstanding, and I'm going to personally ensure that you and your daughters are processed immediately and allowed to leave. Your belongings will be repacked carefully, and you'll be escorted to collect your luggage and proceed to ground transportation. Again, my sincere apologies." But Jinkee was no longer interested in a simple apology and quick exit. She had been humiliated. Her daughters had been traumatized, and she had witnessed the same discriminatory treatment being applied to other Asian travelers who didn't have her status or connections to fight back. She responded to Rodriguez firmly. "I appreciate your apology, Supervisor Rodriguez, but this is not just about expediting my exit. What happened here was racial profiling. Officer Morrison and Officer Tucker made assumptions about me based on my nationality and appearance. They treated me like a criminal despite having diplomatic passports and legitimate documentation, and I saw them treat other Asian travelers the same way. This is a systemic problem, not just a misunderstanding." Rodriguez nodded, understanding the gravity of what she was saying. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Pacquiao, and I assure you this will be investigated thoroughly. Would you be willing to file a formal complaint?" "Yes," Jinkee said without hesitation. "I want to file a formal complaint against both officers, and I want it on record that this is about more than just my personal experience. This is about how your agency treats people of color, particularly Asians, particularly Filipinos." While this conversation was happening, Manny Pacquiao in Manila had already sprung into action. Despite the 14-hour time difference and the fact that it was 3 in the morning in Manila, Manny immediately made phone calls to his contacts. He called the Philippine ambassador to the United States, Jose Manuel Romualdez, who was based in Washington, D.C. He called his U.S.-based lawyer, a prominent civil rights attorney named David Chen, who had represented several high-profile discrimination cases. He called his publicist and instructed her to prepare a press release. And most significantly, he called Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, whom Manny had met at a congressional hearing about international sports, and who had become a friend and supporter. Within minutes, wheels were in motion at the highest levels. Ambassador Romualdez called the State Department liaison for consular affairs. Attorney David Chen called the CBP Office of Professional Responsibility. Senator Blumenthal called the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection directly. And all of them delivered the same message. A high-profile diplomatic incident was unfolding at LAX, involving the wife of a foreign senator, involving clear racial profiling, and it needed to be resolved immediately with consequences for the officers involved. Back at LAX, Jinkee was led to a private office where she could file her formal complaint in detail. She documented everything: the initial interaction with Morrison, his sarcastic and disrespectful tone, the accusation that she was lying, the red card for secondary screening without cause, Tucker's rough handling of belongings and insulting implications about counterfeit goods, and the overall pattern of racial profiling she observed against Asian travelers. While she was filing this complaint, approximately 9 minutes after she sent the text to Manny, Supervisor Rodriguez received an urgent phone call from the CBP port director for LAX, who had just been contacted by the commissioner's office in Washington, D.C. The port director's instructions were clear and direct. Suspend officers Morrison and Tucker immediately, pending investigation. Remove them from the floor. Begin documentation for disciplinary action. And ensure that Mrs. Pacquiao and her family are treated with the utmost courtesy, and that their complaint is taken seriously. Rodriguez walked back to the room where Jinkee was completing her complaint and informed her, "Mrs. Pacquiao, I've just been instructed by the port director that officers Morrison and Tucker have been suspended effective immediately. They are being removed from duty, pending a full investigation into your complaint. Additionally, the Commissioner's office has opened an inquiry into the broader issues you raised about racial profiling at this terminal." Jinkee nodded, satisfied that swift action was being taken. "Thank you, Supervisor Rodriguez. I appreciate that the agency is taking this seriously, but I hope you understand that this isn't just about punishing 2 officers. This is about examining and changing the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place." Within the next hour, several things happened in rapid succession. Jinkee and her daughters were escorted through the rest of customs with the highest level of courtesy. Their luggage was handled carefully, and they were provided with a VIP service vehicle to take them to their hotel. Attorney David Chen arrived at LAX and met with CBP officials to ensure that the complaint process was being handled properly. Media outlets started receiving tips about the incident, and by that evening it was making headlines. Border agents suspended after allegedly profiling wife of boxing legend Manny Pacquiao at LAX. The next morning, the story had exploded into a major international news event. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and all major Philippine news networks covered it extensively. Social media erupted with hashtags like Justice for Jinkee, Now Stop Racial Profiling, and Respect Filipinos trending globally. Thousands of people shared their own experiences of being profiled at U.S. borders, particularly Asian Americans and Asian travelers who had faced similar treatment. The Filipino community in the United States, which numbers over 4 million people, mobilized quickly. Filipino-American organizations issued statements condemning the treatment of Jinkee Pacquiao and calling for systemic reforms at CBP. Community leaders organized protests outside LAX and other major airports. Politicians with Filipino constituents in California, Hawaii, and other states began calling for congressional hearings on racial profiling in border enforcement. The CBP, facing intense public pressure and a potential diplomatic incident with the Philippines, moved swiftly. The commissioner issued a public statement. U.S. Customs and Border Protection takes allegations of discrimination and racial profiling with the utmost seriousness. The officers involved in the incident at LAX on October 15, 2023, have been suspended pending a thorough investigation. We are committed to treating all travelers with dignity and respect, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, or appearance. A full review of our procedures and training protocols is underway to prevent such incidents in the future. But that statement wasn't enough for many people. They wanted specifics. They wanted accountability. They wanted to know what consequences Morrison and Tucker would face, and they wanted to know what systemic changes would be implemented. Within 72 hours, the investigation had progressed rapidly. Internal CBP investigators reviewed the surveillance footage from Booth 7 and from the secondary screening area. The footage confirmed everything Jinkee had reported: Morrison's dismissive body language, his sarcastic responses, his decision to flag her for secondary screening without legitimate cause, and Tucker's rough handling of belongings and insulting remarks. Additionally, the investigators pulled data on Morrison and Tucker's performance records over the previous 6 months and found a disturbing pattern. Both officers had flagged Asian travelers, particularly Filipinos, for secondary screening at rates significantly higher than the statistical average, suggesting systematic racial profiling rather than random selection based on actual risk factors. On October 20th, 5 days after the incident, CBP announced that officers Morrison and Tucker were terminated from employment, effective immediately. The official statement cited gross misconduct, violation of professional standards, discriminatory behavior, and actions inconsistent with CBP values. Both officers lost their federal employment benefits, their security clearances, and their ability to work in any law enforcement capacity in the future. Their careers were over, destroyed by their own racism and arrogance. But the story didn't end with individual firings. The incident sparked a much broader reckoning within CBP and the Department of Homeland Security. Congressional hearings were scheduled, with Jinkee Pacquiao invited to testify about her experience. Civil rights organizations filed class action lawsuits on behalf of other travelers who had faced similar profiling. And internally, CBP was forced to implement major reforms. How do you feel when you're judged based on your appearance, accent, or nationality, rather than your character or credentials? Have you experienced discrimination at airports, borders, or other official checkpoints? Share in the comments your experiences with profiling or bias, because your stories matter, and help build awareness that this isn't an isolated incident, but a systemic problem affecting millions of travelers every year. The reforms implemented by CBP in the wake of the Pacquiao incident were substantial. First, mandatory retraining for all border agents on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and anti-discrimination protocols. Second, installation of additional surveillance cameras with audio recording capabilities at all immigration booths to ensure accountability. Third, establishment of a fast-track complaint system where travelers could report mistreatment via QR codes posted at every booth, with complaints going directly to the Office of Professional Responsibility rather than being filtered through local supervisors. Fourth, quarterly audits of each agent's screening decisions to identify patterns of racial profiling, with consequences for those who showed statistical bias. Fifth, diversification hiring initiatives to ensure that CBP's workforce better reflected the diversity of travelers they served. These reforms weren't perfect, and many advocates argued they didn't go far enough, but they represented significant progress compared to the pre-incident status quo. And they happened because Jinkee Pacquiao refused to stay silent, refused to accept mistreatment, and had the resources and connections to fight back effectively. Jinkee herself became an unexpected advocate for travelers' rights and anti-discrimination efforts. She gave interviews to major news networks, wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post titled, "Why My Experience at LAX Matters for Every Traveler," and partnered with Filipino-American civil rights organizations to create a travelers' rights information campaign. She used her platform not just to share her personal story, but to amplify the voices of countless others who had faced similar treatment, but lacked the visibility or resources to fight back. In her Washington Post op-ed, Jinkee wrote powerfully about the broader implications. When that border agent smirked at me and didn't believe I was married to Manny Pacquiao, he wasn't just doubting my specific identity. He was expressing a deeply held assumption that people who look like me, people from countries like mine, are probably lying, probably trying to scam the system, probably don't belong in spaces of wealth and privilege. That assumption, is racism. And it doesn't just affect celebrities or senators' wives. It affects the Filipino nurse coming to work in an American hospital, the Filipino student coming to study at an American university, the Filipino family coming to visit relatives in California. Every day, thousands of Asians face this kind of profiling at American borders and in American society. My privilege gave me a platform to speak up, but I'm speaking up for all of us, not just for myself. The op-ed went viral, receiving over 2 million shares on social media, and sparking widespread conversations about immigration enforcement, racial profiling, and the Asian American experience. Many Asian Americans, not just Filipinos, shared stories of being treated with suspicion at borders, being asked demeaning questions, being subjected to additional screening for no apparent reason other than their ethnicity. The shared experiences created a sense of solidarity and motivated collective action for reform. Manny Pacquiao, for his part, used his international platform to keep pressure on the issue. In interviews and press conferences, he consistently brought up the incident and the need for systemic change. "My wife is a strong woman," he said in one interview. "She handled this situation with grace and dignity, but she shouldn't have had to. No one should have to face discrimination when they're simply traveling. And the fact that it took my celebrity and connections to get a quick resolution shows how broken the system is for ordinary people who don't have those advantages. That's what needs to change." The incident also strained diplomatic relations between the United States and the Philippines temporarily. The Philippine government issued a formal protest to the U.S. State Department, and President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. publicly called for an investigation and reforms. Several planned diplomatic meetings were postponed pending resolution of the incident. Eventually, Secretary of State Antony Blinken called President Marcos personally to apologize and assure him that the matter was being taken seriously and that reforms were being implemented. At a state dinner several months later, when relations had been repaired, President Marcos gave a toast that referenced the incident. "The true measure of a nation's values is not how it treats its most powerful citizens, but how it treats the vulnerable, the marginalized, the foreign travelers at its borders." The United States, to its credit, responded to an injustice with accountability and reform. That gives me hope that our two nations can continue to work together based on mutual respect, equality, and shared democratic values. For Morrison and Tucker, the fired border agents, the consequences extended far beyond losing their jobs. Their names became synonymous with racial profiling, their actions became case studies in what not to do, and their mugshots circulated widely on social media with condemnation from millions of people. Morrison attempted to do an interview with a conservative news outlet claiming he was the real victim of political correctness and that he had done nothing wrong. But the interview backfired spectacularly when video evidence contradicted his claims, and even the conservative commentators distanced themselves from his defense. Tucker, on the other hand, disappeared from public view entirely. According to reports, he moved to a small town in Idaho and took a job in construction, his law enforcement career completely over. Some might argue that losing their livelihoods was too harsh a punishment, but the overwhelming public opinion was that they got exactly what they deserved: consequences for treating people with cruelty and prejudice. The broader cultural impact of the incident was significant. In the Filipino-American community, it became a watershed moment, a point where the community collectively said enough to the microaggressions, the stereotypes, the assumption that Filipinos were inferior or suspicious. Filipino-American organizations reported surges in membership and activism. Filipino-American candidates for political office referenced the incident in their campaigns, promising to fight against discrimination. Filipino-American students organized campus events about racial profiling and immigrant rights. In the wider Asian American community, the incident resonated because it reflected experiences that many had faced. The model minority myth, the stereotype that all Asians are successful, educated, and wealthy, is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it creates pressure and ignores the diversity of Asian experiences. On the other hand, as the Pacquiao incident showed, even when Asians do achieve wealth and success, they can still face discrimination and disbelief from those who can't reconcile their racist assumptions with reality. Dr. Jennifer Lee, a sociology professor at Columbia University, who studies Asian American experiences, wrote an academic paper analyzing the Pacquiao incident. She noted, "This case is particularly interesting because Jinkee Pacquiao had every marker of status and legitimacy that should have protected her from profiling: diplomatic passports, wealth, connections, fame by marriage. Yet she was still subjected to humiliating treatment because of her Filipino identity. This demonstrates that racial profiling is not primarily about actual risk assessment, but about prejudice and stereotypes that persist regardless of individual circumstances." The incident also sparked important conversations about intersectionality, how different forms of discrimination overlap and compound. Jinkee faced profiling not just as a Filipina, but as a Filipino woman. Some analysts noted that Morrison's particular condescension toward her, his refusal to believe she could be married to someone famous, reflected both racial and gender bias, the assumption that a Filipino woman must have exaggerated her status or importance. 1 year after the incident, in October 2024, a memorial event was held at the Filipino Community Center in Los Angeles. The event, attended by over 1,000 people, celebrated the progress made in the year since the incident, the reforms at CBP, the increased awareness about profiling, the empowerment of the Filipino-American community to speak up about discrimination. Jinkee was the keynote speaker, and she gave a powerful address about the ongoing work needed to combat racism. "A year ago, I experienced something that hurt me deeply," she said to the crowd. "But that hurt turned into purpose. That humiliation turned into motivation, and what could have been just a personal grievance became a movement for change. I'm proud of what we've accomplished together, getting those officers fired, getting policies changed, getting national attention on this issue. But I'm also realistic that one incident, one firing, one policy change is not enough. Racism didn't start with Morrison and Tucker, and it didn't end when they were fired. It's embedded in systems, in institutions, in the unconscious biases that we all carry. So the work continues. We continue to speak up. We continue to demand better. We continue to fight for a world where every traveler, every immigrant, every person is treated with the dignity they deserve." The speech received a 5-minute standing ovation, and many in the audience were crying, moved by her words and by the recognition of shared struggles and collective resilience. The Pacquiao family's vacation, which had started so traumatically, ended up being productive in unexpected ways. Jinkee met with several civil rights organizations during her stay in Los Angeles, donated generously to groups fighting against discrimination, and committed to ongoing advocacy work. Her daughters, despite the trauma of the initial experience, gained a profound education about racism, privilege, and the responsibility that comes with having a platform. Princess, the older daughter, later wrote an essay for her school in Manila about the experience. She wrote, "I used to think that my parents' fame and success meant we would be treated well everywhere we went. That day at LAX taught me that privilege can protect you only partially, that racism can target anyone regardless of status, and that speaking up when you witness injustice is not optional, but obligatory. I'm proud of my mother for not accepting mistreatment silently, for filing the complaint, for pushing for accountability. She showed me what courage looks like." The essay won a national competition in the Philippines and was published in a major newspaper, bringing even more attention to the incident and its lessons for young people. In the years since, the Pacquiao incident has been referenced in multiple contexts, in training materials for border agents showing what not to do, in diversity and inclusion seminars as a case study of unconscious bias consequences, in legal textbooks as an example of swift accountability for discrimination, and in Asian American Studies courses as a watershed moment in the community's political activism. The incident also led to a broader examination of how celebrities and high-profile individuals from developing countries are treated when they travel to the West. Several other celebrities came forward with their own stories of being profiled or disrespected at Western borders despite their fame. A Nigerian Afrobeat star shared his experience of being extensively questioned about drug trafficking at London Heathrow, despite being a famous musician with no criminal record. A Brazilian actress shared her experience of being assumed to be a sex worker when entering the United States for a film festival. a Chinese tech entrepreneur, shared his experience of being treated with suspicion about industrial espionage, despite being the legitimate founder of a successful company. These collective stories painted a picture of systemic bias that extended far beyond one incident at LAX. International organizations began tracking and reporting on discriminatory treatment of travelers. The UN Human Rights Council issued a report specifically addressing racial profiling at border crossings in developed countries, citing the Pacquiao incident as one example among many. The report called for international standards on border enforcement that prohibit discrimination, require cultural competency training, and establish transparent accountability mechanisms. The travel industry also responded. Major airlines began including information about travelers' rights in their pre-flight announcements and in-flight magazines. Travel websites and apps added sections on what to do if you experience discrimination at a border. And travel insurance companies started offering legal assistance coverage, specifically for cases of profiling or mistreatment by immigration authorities. For Jinkee personally, the experience transformed her public role. She had previously been known primarily as Manny Pacquiao's wife, a supportive spouse and mother who occasionally appeared at fights and public events. But after the LAX incident, she became a public figure in her own right, an advocate with her own platform and purpose. She launched a foundation called Dignity for All Travelers, which provides legal assistance and support for people who experience discrimination while traveling, with a particular focus on helping those who don't have the resources or connections to fight back on their own. The foundation has helped hundreds of cases in its first 2 years, from a Filipino domestic worker who was detained and questioned for hours about human trafficking despite being a legal worker with proper documentation, to a Pakistani student who was denied entry to the U.S. despite having a valid student visa and acceptance letter from an American university, to a Mexican family that was separated and held in different rooms for 8 hours because an agent suspected their documents were fraudulent even though they weren't. Before we conclude, I want to ask you, what would you do if you witnessed someone being treated unfairly by authorities? Would you speak up, or would you stay silent out of fear or discomfort? Have you ever been in a situation where you regretted not standing up for someone else, or where you found the courage to intervene? Share in the comments your thoughts on bystander responsibility and allyship, because creating a culture of respect and equality requires all of us to be active participants, not passive observers. The legacy of the border control agents disrespecting Jinkee Pacquiao is multifaceted. On the individual level, it's a story of 2 arrogant officers who paid the price for their racism, losing their careers and reputations deservedly. On the institutional level, it's a story of how one high-profile incident can force a massive bureaucracy like U.S. Customs and Border Protection to confront its problems and implement reforms. On the community level, it's a story of how Filipino Americans and Asian Americans more broadly found their voice, mobilized for change, and refused to accept discrimination as inevitable. And on the universal level, it's a story about human dignity, about the right of every person to be treated with respect regardless of where they're from, what they look like, or how much power they have. The incident reminds us that change is possible, that accountability can happen, but that it requires people to speak up, to refuse to accept mistreatment, to use whatever platform or privilege they have to fight for justice. Jinkee Pacquiao could have accepted the apology and moved on quietly, avoiding the media attention and the hassle of formal complaints and investigations. But she chose differently. She chose to make noise, to file complaints, to go public, to push for firings and reforms. And because of that choice, thousands of travelers who come after her will be treated better, will face less profiling, will have more protections. That's the power of one person standing up. That's the ripple effect of refusing to stay silent. That's why this story matters not just as a piece of celebrity news, but as a lesson in civic courage and social change. The final note on this story came 2 years later, in October 2025, when the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines presented Jinkee Pacquiao with an award from the U.S. State Department for her advocacy work promoting cross-cultural understanding and travelers' rights. In his presentation speech, the ambassador said, Mrs. Pacquiao could have responded to her unfortunate experience at LAX with anger, with retaliation, with a decision to never return to the United States. Instead, she responded with advocacy, with a commitment to make the system better, with a generous assumption that most Americans and most American institutions want to do the right thing if they're held accountable. Her grace under pressure and her constructive approach to reform represent the best of what we hope for in our bilateral relationship between the United States and the Philippines: honest acknowledgement of problems, mutual respect, and partnership to build a better future. Jinkee's acceptance speech at that ceremony was brief but profound. I accept this award not for myself, but on behalf of every traveler who has faced discrimination, every immigrant who has been made to feel unwelcome, every person of color who has been judged by their appearance rather than their character. The work continues. The fight for dignity continues. And I'm honored to be part of this journey, standing side by side with those who refuse to be silenced. Thank you. As she stepped down from the podium, the room erupted in applause once more. It was a moment of full-circle redemption. The woman who had been treated like a criminal in a sterile airport interrogation room was now being celebrated in a grand ballroom as a champion of human rights. The agents who had tried to belittle her were forgotten footnotes in history, while her legacy of courage continued to grow. This story serves as a powerful reminder to all of us. Authority without accountability is tyranny. Badges and uniforms command obedience, but only character and respect command loyalty. Officer Morrison and Officer Tucker forgot that behind every passport, every face, and every traveler is a human being with a story, with rights, and often with a power they cannot imagine. They learned the hard way that you should never judge a book by its cover, and you should certainly never judge a Pacquiao by their patience. Jinkee's patience was not weakness. It was the calm before the storm, a storm that cleaned up a corrupt system and paved the way for a fairer future. So the next time you find yourself in a position of power, remember this story. Remember that respect costs nothing, but disrespect can cost you everything. And if you ever find yourself on the other side, feeling small against a giant system, remember Jinkee Pacquiao. Stand your ground, know your worth, and never be afraid to demand the dignity you deserve. If this story inspired you, please hit the like button and share it with your friends and family. Let's spread this message of respect and equality to every corner of the world. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story about justice, courage, and the truth behind the headlines. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and always stand up for what is right.